At its peak, Central State Hospital held up to 14,000 patients across more than 200 buildings, the largest psychiatric hospital the world had ever seen. This is the full story, from how it began in 1842 and what it reveals about our failures in mental health through my conversation with Jessica Whitehead, director of Central State Hospital Museum in Milledgeville, Georgia.
The hospital opened November 1st of 1842, and the first patient arrived December the 15th of 1842. His name was Tillman Barnett, and he was a 30-year-old farmer from Macon, Georgia. He had a wife. He had an occupation as a farmer, but unfortunately he could become very violent, and not a whole lot of is known about specifically what that looked like for he and his family. Record keeping back then was not what it is now. So he was chained to the back of a wagon, and he was made to walk the entire way from Macon to Milledgeville to the hospital, which was about 47 miles. And once he was here, he was unchained, and he spent the last 6 months of his life here. He died of what they called then maniacal exhaustion the following summer after his arrival. Over the next few years, the hospital grew and grew and grew some more until they constructed a second building, which then separated the men and the women. Previously, men and women had been separated on different corridors or floors and that kind of thing. And so they were able to have a different building completely. And then that was the pattern over the years. The hospital would become overcrowded because of the need. Overcrowding would happen, and then they would be able to get money to build another building. That building would then become overcrowded, and so they just kept kind of adding buildings. Some buildings had to be destroyed once they became outdated, or it was cheaper to build another building than it was to tear the old one down. So that was kind of the process of the hospital. The 50s and 60s would see the Central State Hospital become the largest mental institution in the world, with between 12 and 14,000 inpatients, thousands of staff. Yes. Thousands of staff members, over 200 buildings, thousands of acres. At one time, Central State even had its own farmland, cattle, hogs, slaughterhouse, and it had to be very self-sufficient. So this is the cornerstone for the old state prison farm that was built in 1911. It held the electric chair for Georgia until its closing. There were 162 death sentences carried out at that prison. And the reason why I have it in the Central State Hospital Museum is because I like to point out to people that originally asylums and mental institutions were created to get those suffering from mental illness and other diseases of the mind out of almshouses and jails and prisons and into treatment facilities. Now, our mentally ill are back in our jails and prisons. And so I kind of use this little bit of history from Milledgeville to highlight the fact that our jails and prisons are the largest provider of mental health care in our country. Central State did not have prisons. What happened was, as decentralization took place, and as, for instance, I'll use this as an example, the Rivers Tuberculosis Hospital, it became Rivers Prison. It was transferred over to the Department of Corrections, and then they redid the building so that it could be a prison instead of tuberculosis hospital. And then later it was used as a drug and alcohol rehab for when it was the hospital in the possession of the hospital. Washington building became men's prison, and then the Holly, Ingram, and Kemper buildings became Frank Scott Prison. So Central State has been a mental institution. However, some of the buildings that were once part of Central State Hospital were repurposed to become prisons. Some of these items in this museum actually were part of the old Central State Hospital Museum which was run by state employees many, many years ago. When the hospital finally ended up closing down, those items were put into storage. And then recently, this year, they have been transferred to me to be able to be displayed here in this Central State Hospital Museum. So some of the items the Heritage Center already owned, such as this, but then this stamp was actually part of the old Central State Hospital Museum. The stamp was used when this was called the Milledgeville State Hospital, because Central State changed names several times over the years. And so this is just an old phone directory. I've learned so many things about what was in each of the buildings at the time that this would have been used, which we believe was in the 80s.
I
Yes.
did notice some of the buildings still have that name right
Yes,
above.
I know what buildings you're talking about. Yes, they, of course, because it was all, in granite and stone, so
yeah.
they just left it there. Yes.
Okay.
This is meant to highlight kind of the history of restraint use at the hospital in order to keep people from harming themselves or another patient. And they were used throughout all of the mental institutions in the United States and the world, in fact. So it's unfortunate that, you would be led to have to actually physically restrain someone using wrist cuffs or leg cuffs or a straitjacket. But in the interest of keeping people safe, that was kind of what they had to use. I mean, they didn't have other methods because we didn't have the medication at that time. We also have medications that have now been studied and have been around and are now in. I think with medication and also all of the different forms of therapy, we've come a very long way. I think where we are failing is with access to those treatments and therapies and medications. People who are seeking outpatient mental health treatment, especially in rural areas where we don't have public transportation, where people are a little bit more isolated, I think it can be really hard for them just to access those services. Art therapy has always been a pretty big part of the hospital's culture. Painting, this cabin is made from like pine cones, rolled paper, clay, cotton, metal. And then we have some other, like this ceramic fruit bowl was painted and gifted to a staff member here. This little house, you can see it's made with moss and pebbles. This has always been great for patients to be able to have that self-expression as part of their kind of therapeutic journey at the hospital. And, because resources have often been scarce, that's why you see this type of creativeness out of just common items. The pine cones, obviously, we always have plenty of red clay here in Georgia.
Yeah.
So just being able to have that self-expression, have something that is keeping them busy and engaged is very important. This painting was done by a patient at the Cook building. So that is Central State Hospital's current incarnation, is the Peyton Cook building, which is a 182 bed maximum secure forensic hospital. So patients not only did art, they not only participated in music therapy and the like, they also were able, those that were able to, built a lot of furniture here at the hospital. That was just another way for them to have a therapeutic outlet. And my understanding is that chairs just like this one used to be line the porch and the hallways in Powell. So you can tell that it was handcrafted. And it's still in really great shape. I'm not quite sure of the year that this would have been built, but the fact that patients got to, engage in these types of activities that kept them busy and kept them engaged in some kind of therapeutic outlet was super important for their well-being. This map hung in the Arnold building, which has now been demolished, for a great many years. And it gives a reasonably good idea of how large the hospital was at one time. Now, this doesn't show all of everything. For instance, this is Vincent Highway, and so you would have to go all the way out here, would be the Cook building and the Kidd building. So, like, again, it doesn't show everything. There were also across Vincent Highway, there were many, many doctors' houses and staff houses. So we are right here in this tiny little building on this big map. This is the Powell building. So this would have been the original building built in 3 segments. The first being 1842, the second 1847, so 1842, 1847, and then in 1858, this long white building that you see in the front was constructed to attach the other 2 buildings that were parallel kind of in the back. This, so we talked about buildings that were once part of Central State Hospital becoming prisons. So this is one that I mentioned. This was the Washington building, which became men's prison. And then down here are the Ingram, Kemper, and Holly buildings, which became Frank Scott Prison. And then up here, the Rivers Tuberculosis Hospital, this became Rivers Prison. So the next buildings to be built would have been the Walker and the female convalescent. So male and female convalescent buildings on alternating sides of the Pecan Grove. The female convalescent building, part of it was torn down except for the very front, which has one of the cornerstones for the hospital that says the State Lunatic Asylum. That part remains standing. The Walker building is also still standing. The green building, this is actually the second green building that was built here at the hospital. The first building was right outside of the depot where Binion sits now. So this green building was built in 1947. And then we have the Jones Hospital. So it was the Jones building. And it was the medical surgical center for the hospital, and it opened in 1931. We also have the Chapel of All Faith, which is the largest of the 5 chapels on the grounds of the hospital.
Which one stayed till like the very end, like open?
Obviously, Powell was one of the last to close, but Binion, the one that's right outside of the depot, was because it was the forensic hospital. And then once the Cook building became fully operational, the Binion building was then able to close completely. And that was 2008, 2009.
You say 2008, 2009. Did the whole Central State Hospital close at that time?
By then, yes.
By then, okay.
Pretty much everything had closed except for the forensic. One of the treatments popular at one time was electroconvulsive therapy. And so this electroconvulsive therapy machine was used here at the hospital, sending alternating shocks through the hemispheres of the brain. And it would lead to convulsions and then most of the time unconsciousness. And then it was thought to, be a fix, especially for depression, anxiety. They pretty much used it for for everything. So ECT is still used today, but it's done under anesthesia. And it is different, and it's very much well studied, and it's only used in the worst cases of especially depression. Break in and vandalize the buildings for so many years, then it means that those buildings deteriorate more quickly. Unfortunately, you're now seeing that with the Powell building since it's been empty for some time now. To go inside, you would be able to tell where it has been destroyed. I mean, it's like people go in and use it as a rage room and bust down holes in the walls, and there are a few pieces of furniture left in there, so they'll throw the furniture through the walls, they'll bust out the windows, they'll spray spray paint graffiti on the inside of the building. So unless something is done, eventually the Powell building will be have deteriorated much the same as the other ones. First, of course, it had all the patients, the one wing did. Then, they were able to separate the men from the women once the second wing was built. And then once this part was built, to connect those two parallel structures, um, this was admissions, patient housing. The superintendent had a space to live in the Powell building. There was a chapel in the Powell building and in several of the other buildings throughout campus. So, really, it changed over the years. The last thing was that did have most of the administrative offices for the hospital. So, this building is the Binion building. It was built and opened in 1946. And this building was used for what we used to call the criminally insane, which we now call forensic patients. So it's people that had committed a crime and they were thought to not be able to understand the court process. And so they would be housed here where they could be stabilized on medication, where they could receive treatment, where they could be taught how to assist in their defense. The building also housed those found not guilty by reason of insanity. Building closed. It was around 2008, 2009. A new building was constructed called the Peyton Cook Building. Peyton Cook was a chaplain here at the hospital, so that's who the building is named after. And it was designed for the forensic patients. And so once it became fully operational, this building then was closed. Another interesting feature of the Binion building is that it's shaped like an eight. There's razor wire around the top of the building, even though you can see it's a multi-story building, so that if someone tried to scale the walls, they wouldn't be able to then get on the roof and leave somehow.
Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting.
And that's where patients were able to play basketball or have, just outdoor time, but it still be within the confines of the building itself. It was opened in March of 1931. The different floors had different populations of patients. With the third floor, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was for like the surgical or hospitalized patients that has purchased the Jones, the Green, and the Walker buildings and is going to rehab them into housing, retail shops, event center. So I think that in the next few years, we're going to see a lot more life breathed into the campus, which is amazing. A few years ago, after the death of my mentor, Dr. Greg Jarvie, who worked here at Central State Hospital as a consultant for many years, he was also a full-time professor at Georgia College and State University. We had made plans to bring some groups of students here and do just some history. Dr. Jarvie and I spent a lot of time talking about mental health treatment, talking about the hospital, talking about the history of mental health treatment, the breakages in the system that we currently have to treat the mentally ill. And so after his unexpected death, I bought a camera on Facebook Marketplace. It was like a 15-year-old Nikon camera. And I decided that I would come out and take some pictures. It was very cathartic for me. Just a way to kind of deal with his passing and also, um, a positive outlet, as those types of hobbies normally are. And I was as surprised as anybody else that the pictures were good, because I don't have any training or anything like that. And I realized that I could use that photography to start conversations about the history of the hospital and mental health treatment. So that helped me become a mental health advocate. I did work in mental health for about 14 years before I came to work for the court system, which I have been with for 11 years. And so mental health advocacy has always been really important to me, especially as someone who has mental health issues in the form of post traumatic stress disorder, ADHD, and I also have a dissociative disorder due to a lifetime of trauma. So I did have my photography gallery downtown Milledgeville. And when people would come in and view it, I got to be a historian, I got to be a photographer, I got to be a mental health advocate. And so it all just kind of began to flow together. I wanted to create a book called Seeking Asylum that included pictures of the hospital and that included a history of the hospital. Um, that book ended up being both of those things, as well as my own personal mental health journey. And I had to make myself very vulnerable in order to show the part of me that suffers to the rest of the world. But in doing so, I feel like I have been able to be a part of a movement by people who are mental health advocates to highlight the failures that we have in our mental health care system and be able to offer some hope to those who are struggling in their day to day life, because it is a struggle. As the president of the board of Georgia's El Capital Heritage Center, which is where the Central State Hospital Museum is located, I decided that I wanted to highlight the history out here as a way to bring people out to the campus and teach them about mental health treatment. And you can't have, teach people about Central State without teaching them about mental health treatment and without being a mental health advocate. So it all kind of flowed together in that way. And so I went to the board and I asked them if they would allow me to curate a museum, which I'd never done before. And they were like, yeah, go for it, Jessica. That sounds like a great plan. And so it took me about 5 months and we opened up the museum. I moved my photography gallery to the museum because I couldn't be so many places all the time at one time. So that is kind of how it all got combined. Um, and it's important to me that it remain combined so that way people can experience the history in different ways, either through the photography or through the facts or through the artifacts that are included in the museum, through the driving tour that we offer in partnership with the Visit Milledgeville or the Citizens Visitors Bureau. So we're just trying to tell this story. And this story, the story of the patients at Central State Hospital, could very easily be my story. Had I been born at a different time in a different era, I could definitely see myself being a patient here at the hospital.
What would you say is one thing that you hope that all these visitors take from the Central State Hospital history?
I would like for them to have a renewed sense of empathy for those who suffer from severe and persistent mental illness or other diseases of the mind. Um, I feel like experiencing the campus and learning about the patients that lived and many times died here, you can't help but to have a more personal perspective um, regarding those stories. And it can be very powerful. A lot of people that visit the museum have relatives that were here at Central State Hospital as a patient. A lot of Milledgevillians worked here, their parents worked here, their grandparents worked here. And so this place is really embedded in the history of Georgia and the history of mental institutions throughout the world. I mean, it runs parallel with stories from other places that treated the mentally ill.
This campus is huge, but if
Yes.
you had to choose only one building with its history, its charm still.
Yeah.
Which one is Jessica's favorite building?
The Rivers complex is actually, for whatever reason, my favorite. There are tunnels that connect the buildings that it seemed is just fascinating to me. The tunnels were used when it was a tuberculosis hospital to get food from the kitchen very efficiently to all three buildings in that complex because they believed that access to hot food had a restorative effect on tuberculosis patients. And so it was really important to them to disperse that food throughout the hospital quickly. The buildings themselves are beautiful. There's marble in the entryways. And I can still see the beauty in that place even after it became a prison, which is what the photography shows now, are the elements of the prison. But you can still see the marble in the entryways. You can still see the double cross on the outside of the buildings, which is a symbol for the American Lung Association. Um, so it's just a fascinating building, and I love it. I love to go through that building. I actually have the architect's plans for that building, um, and so you can see where so much time and effort was put into every small detail of where patients would be housed, where staff would have things. It's just fascinating.